Thanks to everybody for coming and to IHO for inviting me to be part of this year-long celebration of the 50th anniversary of Lucy's discovery. But Lucy's a fossil of a creature that lived 3.2 million years ago, okay? So why am I here talking about chimpanzees? Well, the answer, as you'll find in a minute, lies in our behaviors, you'll see. So as Johannes mentioned, one of my goals today is to highlight the importance of long-term studies and the unique data set that we're really fortunate to have here at IHO and the Institute and ASU. So among vertebrates, humans are outliers in the degree to which we cooperate. So by cooperate, I mean helping others. So there we have lots of examples at small scale. Here we have Turkana pastoralists digging wells. We have Hadza hunter-gatherers hunting zebra. Then we have large-scale cooperation in terms of massive armies. We play sports, and sometimes we take great risks to help strangers. So there are many explanations for why we cooperate to such a great degree. These include punishment, which you heard about in Sarah Matthews' talk last month. But another is the existence of pairwise relationships. So pairs with close bonds are more likely to cooperate with one another, and these relationships result in complex networks of relationships. So as anthropologists, we're interested in when and why this tendency to form strong social bonds arose. Are they unique to our lineage? What benefits did such relationships confer to our early ancestors? So to answer this question, we need to make inferences about extinct species. So we can make some conclusions about behavior from fossils, like general social system, but complex social behavior doesn't fossilize. So our best alternative is to turn to our closest living relatives, the great apes, for clues. Studies of all primates are informative, Joan. But we are especially interested in chimpanzees and bonobos, to which we are most closely related. So we're genetically very similar. We are likely faced with many of the same foraging problems, social and ecological problems that early hominins probably were. So this is why we study chimpanzees and bonobos. So I have to stress that we don't view chimps and bonobos as exact replicas of the earliest hominins, but instead they provide us with clues as to what the behavior might have been like, much like fossils provide clues about anatomy. And chimpanzees are really difficult to study. They have long lives. They live 50 to 60 years in the wild, and they are slow to mature and reproduce. They're very social, but they live in groups that have relatively few adults. So mean community size across African populations, the mean community size is around 50, with only 12 or so adult males. So this is a much smaller sample size than for many other species. There are, of course, some very large communities, as I'm sure you're going to hear about in the next talk, but they're challenging to study. So moreover, they have high fission-fusion dynamics, which means that they have flexible grouping patterns. So that community of 50-odd individuals is never all together at once, and they don't move together like a troop of baboons or a group of gorillas. So instead, they form subgroups, which we call parties, that change in size and composition over the course of days and weeks in response to ecological and social factors. So sometimes large parties form, other times the chimps are all very scattered around looking for food in ones and twos. So this means that we miss all the behavior that's happening in parties that we're not right there with, right? So this is a big challenge for studying social relationships, and sometimes we don't see individuals for weeks at a time. And finally, a bit of a spoiler alert, they have complex social relationships that require loads of data in order to characterize. So one solution to all of these problems is to use long-term data decades of data to provide the sample size needed to actually rigorously and scientifically test our hypotheses. So let's flash back to July 14th, 1960. Louis Leakey, the famed paleoanthropologist, sent young Jane Goodall to what would become Gombe National Park in Tanzania to learn about the origin of human behavior by studying chimpanzees, exactly what we're still doing today. At that time, very little was known about chimpanzee behavior in the wild. Jane was famously untrained and therefore unbiased, and was also exceptionally patient. So she spent the first couple of years watching chimpanzees from afar, since they would run away from her when she approached. But as time went on, the chimps gradually got used to her presence, and she was able to observe their behavior up close. And so she made really detailed observations of daily behavior, and made several groundbreaking discoveries that we've all heard about. At least these are groundbreaking as far as the Western world was concerned. So this includes tool use, meat eating, complex social relationships, individual personalities, and so on. So by the late 60s, there was a large research presence at Gombe. There are many students, both graduate and undergraduate, many from Stanford, and many of these went on to become famous scientists in their own right. So these include our own Joan Silk. Also in this picture we have Richard Wrangham, Craig Packer, and others. And so these students were all there mainly collecting their own data for their own projects, but importantly, Jane always emphasized the importance of taking general, daily, systematic data. And so everybody took part in this as well. So then starting in the early 70s, the students, and then after a couple of years, the local Tanzanian observers started systematic follows of the chimpanzees each day. They would choose a target, or we call it a focal chimpanzee, and follow him or her all day long, and collecting various kinds of data that we'll talk about in a minute. So amazingly, this data collection continues today, essentially unchanged. So this makes this the longest continuously running study of wild chimpanzees in the world, and it has produced more than 50 years of consistent daily data on this one population. Kind of amazing. So then in 1986, Jane famously shifted her focus mainly to conservation, chimpanzee well-being, youth engagement, essentially saving the world, as we know. But data collection at Gombe continued, funded by the Jane Goodall Institute, which was founded for that reason. So then my PhD advisor, Ann Pusey, who was a PhD student at Gombe in the 70s, with Jane's blessing, spearheaded this ambitious campaign to organize and transport all of the paper data that were piling up in Jane's house in Dar es Salaam to the University of Minnesota, where she was then a professor. So then she and her team, which I joined in 1997, worked with computer scientists to transform these paper data into actual digital data that we can analyze. So Anne then continued this work for quite some time and then retired from Duke University in 2019. So recently, IHO and ASU established formal partnerships with the Jane Goodall Institute. So here's President Michael Crow and Jane sealing the deal. Ignore the creepy green shirt guy in the background. So ASU and IHO and JGI are really like-minded institutions with exciting plans to work together on global conservation projects, education, outreach, and so on. But also one of the main goals of this partnership is to preserve, curate, share, and use this Gombe Research Archive to study the behavior and biology of wild chimpanzees. So this archive is located just upstairs in this beautiful, still new building, sort of right up there. And it's protected by our new fire and waterproof cabinets that we're very proud of. And every sheet has also been scanned at very, very high resolution. So what kind of data do we have? I'm not going to go through all of them, but we have some of Jane's all of Jane's original notes, including her journal. So she'd come home at night and summarize her observations in a journal. We have check sheets of behavior that are extracted from observations by Jane and by the early students. So this is one tabulating rates of aggression, submission, and reassurance. We have all the data from the mother-infant study, which is a parallel study that began in the late 60s and continues today, another one of these daily data collection type things. And maps of chimpanzee movements from focal follows. That continued till about 2015 when we brought in GPS. Then there are massive check sheets, cleverly called big charts, that include extracted data, again, on aggression, mating, and so on from observations at the feeding station, which is where the chimpanzees were initially provisioned with bananas. We have the character files are compilations of the behaviors of specific individuals. So this is stemming from Jane's early interest in personality. And finally, most relevant to this talk, we have data from daily focal follows of adults that are still ongoing today, that are conducted by our Tanzanian field assistants. So the travel and group check sheets on the left capture data on the timing of arrival and departures of chimpanzees into and out of the focal chimps group. Also records what the focal is eating, encounters with other species, and things like that. And so we use these data from these check sheets to quantify our association patterns that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Then a second observer is recording longhand narrative notes of everything that the focal chimpanzee is doing, including grooming, which you'll see is important, as well as conspicuous behaviors by the entire group, like aggression, dominance interactions, mating, hunting, and so on. So over the years, and again, this is all thanks to Ann Pusey, we've had a small army by now of students and volunteers who manually enter and extract these data and enter them into check sheets. So, hi guys, thank you. So right now we have a fabulous team of more than 15 undergrads, both in person and online, as well as 3 grad students who are using the long-term data as part of their dissertation project. So very much a team effort. So poor undergrads extract all these data, then we enter them into a relational database, which is simply a set of basic tables, each one containing a particular single type of data, like feeding or grooming or aggression. And each one of these tables is linked by common fields like date and time and chimpanzee ID. So for every, say, grooming bout, we can easily determine which chimps were there in the party, where they were in the park, whether there was aggression, mating, and so on in the same time. So this seems simple, but what it allows us to do is to do the kinds of powerful analyses that I'm about to show you. So what I want to do now is give you a taste of how we use these long-term data to answer questions, and in particular the question that I outlined at the beginning, what is the form and function of male chimpanzee social bonds? So again, this is all a giant collaboration. So this is work that was done primarily by my former grad student, Joel Bray, as part of their dissertation research, and Joseph Feldblum, who's an assistant research professor at Duke University. Don't worry, this is not going to be a big data talk, but very briefly, we used data spanning 1978 through 2015 on 26 adult males. So this meant that we analyzed 157 pairs or dyads of individuals. To estimate the strength of social relationships, we looked at 2 behaviors: association in the same party. So essentially, this is the amount of time that 2 individuals spent together in small parties. We restricted our analyses to time spent in small groups because we felt that these are more representative of true association preferences. And then for grooming, we simply calculated the proportion of time that dyads groomed one another when both of them were together in the same party. And then from the demographic records, we know things like age and sex and maternal relatedness. And so we constructed dominance hierarchies based on the timing of submissive vocalizations. And then finally, we used genetic paternity data using DNA extracted from fecal samples to identify fathers of offspring. So here's a figure showing the range of variation that we see in the strength of social bonds, measured in this case by association frequency. The grooming figure looks basically the same. So what I want you to do is look first at the orange squares and blue triangles that are laid across the bottom. Each one of those points represents a dyad year, so data from a pair of individuals for a given year. And you can see that we have pairs on the left that almost never associated together in small groups, and then ones on the right that spent 20% of their time together in small groups. So there's a lot of variation there. So right there we see differentiated social relationships. Then the colors indicate whether the pairs are maternal brothers or not. And in the blue, they are maternal brothers. Orange, other males that aren't maternal brothers. So don't have time. This is not the place to discuss any statistics, especially since Tom Morgan is here. But Bayesian models that control for all kinds of variables, confounding variables, showed that maternal brothers, on average, formed stronger bonds than other dyads. And the orange and blue distributions essentially tell us that we can be really confident that the means from these two different sets are very different. But, as I said, there are plenty of unrelated males, and maternal brothers that are close in age are actually relatively rare. So there are plenty of unrelated males that did form really strong bonds. So there's plenty of yellow squares over to the far right. We actually found no clear-cut explanation for why this was. We looked at things like age similarity, rank similarity, and didn't come up with a satisfying explanation for why those particular pairs formed strong bonds. And this likely is probably one thing we want to test, is whether or not individuals with compatible personalities are more likely to form bonds. And so that's something that one of my grad students, Savannah Troha, is interested in looking at. So we also found that association and, again, grooming rates were stable. So this figure here shows the correlation between a pair's association index in, say, this year, year T, on the y-axis, and last year, T-1 on the left, and then on the other one, the association between T and year T-2. The dots, again, show the raw data, and the purple and black lines show that there's a positive correlation. If we were to show year T-3, T-4, et cetera, you would see no relationship at all. So this means that, on average, social bonds lasted for 2 years. But it doesn't, 2 years doesn't seem like very long, right? But as I said, this is an average. So when we classified bonds as strong or not, based on comparison with the rest of the sample, we found that some strong bonds lasted for as long as 13 consecutive years. So really strong bonds there. So Kevin's here, John Matani's here. So far, this isn't big news, right? Kevin showed that same kin effect in 2007, and John, and then Richard Wrangham and I showed this same stability result in separate studies in 2008 and 2009. But what's been really elusive so far is what the benefits of these bonds are. So in 2 different papers that I'm going to discuss now briefly, again, Joel Bray, Joseph Feldboom, and I showed that there are at least 2 benefits that we can identify to forming social bonds. So the first, shown here, is that social bonds are associated with a greater probability of increasing in dominance rank. So males compete fiercely over dominance, which leads to increased mating success. higher ranking individuals sire more offspring because they're better able to compete for mating opportunities and are possibly maybe more attractive mates. So here we found that males with more strong bond partners in a given year showed a greater chance of increasing in rank, or a greater increase in rank measured in the following year. So we hypothesized that this was because males that form strong social bonds form coalitions with one another, cooperative coalitions, which enable them to rise in rank. So we tested this idea in a second study, this one led by Joseph Feldblum. And here we identified 3 different pathways to increased male reproductive success. And here we measured reproductive success by the number of offspring fathered, or the probability of fathering a given infant. So first pathway, and this is why males compete so fiercely for rank, is the alpha male, the highest ranking male, is responsible for way more than his fair share of paternities. So in terms of fathering offspring, it's good to be the alpha, so you got to try to become alpha as best you can. But most males don't become alpha. So what do you do if you are a subordinate male? We found that subordinate males, this is in the upper left schematic, subordinate males that formed strong bonds with the alpha himself fathered more offspring than expected by their rank. And this is consistent with a previous paper that we published showing that in mating context, alpha males are sort of more forgiving or less competitive with males in a mating context, with their social bond partners in a mating context, or essentially conceding matings. And then finally, we found that subordinates with strong ties or strong bonds with lots of other subordinates, so not including the alpha, did indeed participate in more coalitions, okay? And that those coalitions led to higher reproductive success for those individuals. So, to conclude, these and other studies have demonstrated that male chimps form strong social bonds that can last for years. And we now have evidence that these bonds have advantages in terms of dominance rank and ultimately reproductive success. So, to bring it back to Lucy, assuming that the last common ancestors of humans, chimps, and bonobos was chimp-like, we can conclude that the foundation for the evolution of human friendship, and in turn more complex social relationships, were present at the base of our lineage. And natural selection will have acted upon that tendency. So, and then finally, I hope that I've demonstrated the value of long-term studies for understanding the behavior of our closest living relatives. So before I hand it over to my well-dressed colleague, I'd like to thank the Tanzanian agencies that gave us permission for conducting our research, and then, of course, our dedicated staff on the ground at Gombe, who are absolutely essential to this work. They know far more about chimpanzees than those of us who visit for just short periods of time, and without them this work would not be possible. And then, of course, we're deeply grateful to our matriarch, who fundamentally changed the field of primatology and happened to turn 90 last week. So, and finally, hugely expensive project for which we've had a number of generous funders over the years. Thank you very much.